Welcome to South Asia Chat, a podcast brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. I am your host, Ramita Iyer, research analyst at the Institute. The Indian Parliament, during a special session from 18th to 22nd September 2023, passed the 128th Constitutional Amendment Bill 2023, which mandates one-third reservation for women in India's lower house of the Parliament as well as state assemblies. The bill, which was cleared with near unanimity, also extends the quota to the seats reserved for the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes. In this episode, we will be looking at the content, the journey, and the implications of the Women's Reservation Bill. I am pleased to be joined by Professor Krishna Menon, Professor of Gender Studies in the School of Human Studies at Dr. B.R. Ambedkar University, Delhi. Professor Menon, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Ramita. It's my pleasure to be with you.
Now, this is not the first time that the government has introduced such a bill. In fact, since 1996, nearly every government has attempted to push a women's reservation bill. Could you take us through the journey of the bill?
Thank you, Ramita. That's really a very, very comprehensive question. It covers almost every aspect of the bill, but let's try and break it up and look at it historically and then look at it at the contemporary moment as well. So, as you said very rightly, it was passed in a special session of the Parliament, the bill, the Women's Reservation Bill, and we must remember that this is the first bill to be passed in the new building of the Parliament of India. So, it's a historic occasion accompanied by, as some commentators have said, a lot of histrionics as well. So, what is the history? What is the drama attached to this bill? That becomes a fascinating topic for us to engage with. You are absolutely right that this is not the first time that the government has tried to introduce the Women's Reservation Bill. It has a 20-odd year history of hanging in the Parliament. But there is a longer history of debate and engagement with the idea of reservation itself in Indian politics. Quota, as it's sometimes referred to. One of the earliest discussions on women's reservation or reservation of any kind actually goes back to the pre-independence period. So it's really important for us to know that it's not 2023 when this idea has been thought of. There is a long history and a rather contentious, complex, and very interesting history, which actually tells us a lot about the fault lines in Indian politics itself and in political thinking itself. So, as early as, you'd be surprised to know, as early as 1919, when the British passed the Government of India Act 1919, it enabled women to vote in legislative council elections. So that is actually one of the, so that's not independent India, but it is one of the earliest occasions of bringing women into modern electoral processes. The Government of India Act 1919 was followed by some legislative councils, state legislative councils. So, for example, the Madras Legislative Council in 1921 actually enabled women to vote and become legislators. So, in a sense, it's a path-breaking moment in the history of women and their participation in legislative decision-making. 1926 is actually a very important year in this history when we discuss it, because that's the year when Dr. Muthulakshmi Reddy becomes the first nominated woman to be part of the Legislative Council. And her history is very rich and interesting, but this is not the time to go into that. 1935, the Government of India Act 1935 actually grants 41 reserved seats for women in provincial legislatures. So there was already a conversation about women and their participation in legislative processes, in legislative decision making. But it's fascinating to see what women in India were thinking. So this is pioneered by the British government. But the women in the national movement stalwarts such as Sarojini Naidu, for instance, later Sucheta Kriplani, Rajkumari Amrit Kaur, they were of the view that reservations for women in parliament, any kind of quota for women in politics, would be an admission of lack of merit. So they were strictly opposed to the idea of reservations. Not only did they think it was admission of lack of merit, they had enough trust and faith in independent India's democratic machinery to give them the opportunity to shine and come through. They also felt that it could potentially divide the Indian election scenario, and it could weaken national unity. So these were some of the reasons, because we have to remember that this was the time when people's imagination was fired by the cause of the anti-colonial movement, nationalism, unity. So they felt any quota, any introduction of quota would be divisive, and hence they were steadfastly opposed to. Not all women, but the really important leaders, the prominent figures. So, for example, Dr. Reddy herself, who I mentioned earlier, she began as an advocate of quota, but by the time the constitution was to be framed, she had changed her thinking on it. So there was a lot of back and forth, debate and discussion amongst women's organizations themselves prior to independence. And then comes the moment of constitution making. In the Constituent Assembly, there were about 11 women who were part of the Constituent Assembly. And they were absolutely sure that women must not have any special quota within Parliament for the reasons that I just stated. Now, then comes the first elections, and women's representation, not surprisingly, in Parliament was rather low. Little less than 5%. And most of the women who get elected in the first elections, through the first elections, were women who were members of the Constituent Assembly in any case. And what is really important for us to remember here is, or to notice here is, not just the numbers. So they were few in number, very few. But the quality that they brought into the Parliament, and the kind of interventions that they made in Parliament, I think they are outstanding. Some of the most extraordinary interventions, which today in 2023 seem so far-sighted, so progressive, so very feminist in their thinking, if I might say so, was made by just this 4.4% women. So thereby hangs a note of warning for us that it is not numbers alone that matter. What really does matter eventually is what these legislators, women legislators, will bring to the table. While it's very important to be at the table, there's no doubt about that, but what will they bring to the table? So for instance, I'd like us to know that, Renu Chakravarti, she was elected from West Bengal in the first parliament. She actually tries to introduce a legislation which talks about equal pay for equal work for both men and women. That's incredible. There were similarly very interesting interventions made about laws against adultery. Not the time for me to elaborate on these, but they would really give us an insight into the quality of parliamentarians, women parliamentarians that we had. So it was agreed upon that the only quota that the parliament would have would be the ones based on the caste and tribe, scheduled caste and scheduled tribe, SC/ST quota as it's called. The seats would be reserved, parliamentary constituencies would be reserved on this basis, but not for women. As time went by, we know that in the 1970s, the government of India actually appoints a committee to look at the status of women in India. And this committee produces the landmark report, the Towards Equality report, which actually brought together for the first time to public attention and to the notice of policy makers facts and figures about women's health, employment, education, political participation, and other such data. And it was clear that women's political participation did not present a very happy picture. But despite that, what is important for us to notice that the committee resolutely voted against quota for women, because they felt that they are daughters of independent India, and there is this wonderful constitution, and we have a democratic system. There was great deal of optimism and hope. Although I have to say that two very important members of the committee actually present a note of dissent, differing from the majority opinion, and they advocated for quota, but the majority's opinion stood, and thus there was no attempt to introduce quota. But by the 1980s and 1990s, the Indian society, Indian politics was changing very rapidly, and 1990s is the period of what is sometimes called mandalization of Indian politics, where caste-based mobilization in North India, especially of the other backward caste, begins to gather strength, and there is a new thinking about quotas in politics and a new approach to the understanding of equality, which moves away from a purely formal to a more substantive understanding of equality, where it was understood that despite formal equality, in an unequal context, some special measures might have to be taken in the interest of reinforcing equality. And that's how the OBC expansion of quota for OBCs was being defended and argued for. This had a great impact on the thinking of the women's movement itself in India, which began to very, very vociferously advocate for expansion of or an introduction of quota. So it's a long journey that the opinions of women in politics, women in social movements, from resolute opposition to the idea of quota to the 1990s, where there is a different kind of thinking. And then I think 1992 becomes a very important year, because that's the year when the Constitution is amended, the 73rd and the 74th Amendment, which brings in quota for women in the local levels of governance, which is the Panchayati Raj institutions. There was some skepticism. People thought that, some people thought that it's not going to make much of a difference. These women are going to be proxy candidates for their husbands and fathers-in-law, and it's really going to be a cosmetic measure. But that's not how things turned out. Study after study is showing that there is a discernible impact of having women in Panchayati Raj institutions at policy making levels. So I think 92, the experience of Panchayati Raj institutions consolidates the commitment towards introducing the Women's Reservation Bill, as it was done finally in 96, to be passed now in 2023.
Professor, thank you so much for taking us through the entire journey of, not only the bill, but of reservation for women in India itself. Now, coming to the bill that was recently passed, could you throw some light on what this bill is about and what does it aim to address?
So, this bill, firstly, it has a new name now. It's no longer called the Women's Reservation Bill. It's called Nari Shakti Vandan Adhiniyam. Nari Shakti means women's power. Vandan means adoration, veneration, worship, and Adhiniyam is a statute. Okay, so this is a legislation to venerate the power of women. There's some discomfort. Many people have expressed their discomfort with this kind of a nomenclature, and that discomfort gets amplified when you look at the statement of objectives that accompanies the bill. So, if you know, every bill that's introduced in the Parliament in India has an accompanying statement of objectives, which explains why, what, context, etc., etc. And tellingly, the statement of objectives to this bill refers to the ease of living for women that measures that this government has undertaken. And it mentions, for example, the subsidy on cooking gas, the famous Ujjwala scheme, construction of toilets as part of the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, financial inclusion of women, and such measures. In that context, yet another measure is the Women's Reservation Bill. Now, when you read or when you place the Women's Reservation Bill in this company, it looks like a welfare measure. Yeah, this in itself is, I think, from the point of view of, if you do a gendered reading of these welfare schemes, it seems as though it's only women who need to eat food and therefore need cooking gas, and that it's only women who need toilets and therefore but they are presented as, what I'm trying to say is that universally, these are universal requirements and rights in any civilized society, but there's a gendered rendering of these provisions, and it is in the scheme of these welfare provisions that the Women's Reservation Bill is being placed by the statement of objectives. Will this mean that the bill will become just a kind of largesse that the state is doling out? Or is the bill, so if you look at the history of the bill that I just spoke about, the women's movement as well as women in, civil society groups, women who have thought about politics and women's representation, they have consistently focused on women's equality in politics. And whenever they've spoken about quota, it has been in the context of reinforcing political equality, both by participating in elections as voters as well as being able to stand for the election and get elected and be part of the parliamentary process to influence decision making. So they see it as an essential part of their citizenship that will enable them to make change, initiate policy, be part of the democratic process. A concern is that that whole aspect of Women's Reservation Bill being placed in the context of a discourse on political equality, rights and democratic participation has been eliminated. There is nothing really in the objectives to the bill that talks about this, but it places it in this context. So a lot of political observers and astute scholars are wondering whether this will also be seen as merely yet another welfare measure, or will it really become the precursor for the kind of democratic transformation that women have been hoping for. As you know, the bill also says, now of course it's an act, it's no longer a bill, it says very clearly that it is contingent upon the conduct of various other government initiatives, so the census and delimitation. So the time frame is really not stated anywhere in the bill. When you do that, the concern again is, will it really happen? How long will it take? Is the intention to implement the bill, or is it just a cosmetic gesture? And then, of course, the prickly issue of the OBC quota, or the quota within quota as it is called, which has not been spoken about at all in this bill. So these are some of the contentious or worrying aspects of the bill. But I think every bill or every act finally comes to life based on the power of people's involvement in democratic processes. So this is not the time to lose hope, because I do think it's a very, very important initiative. And things could change in the way women's groups, women's movements have been hoping, but the energies will have to come from us, the people of India.
I want to delve into a couple of the contentious issues that you mentioned. The first, of course, is overlinking the bill to the census and the delimitation exercise. So, this means that the bill will not be enacted until these two exercises are carried out, which experts have said will push the earliest possible implementation date to approximately 2028 or 2029. But, like you said, we don't have a clear date. Now, apart from this, the linking itself is considered problematic, given that both are supposed to be independent exercises, and delimitation has been a contentious issue for many states over the years. Could you share more on this controversy and why it matters for this women's reservation bill?
So, delimitation again has a complicated history. Since India's independence, there have been about 4 delimitation commissions. So 1952, 63, 72 or 73, and then 2002. Since then, there has been no delimitation. So delimitation actually means redrawing the electoral constituencies to reflect population changes. So that is why the exercise of delimitation is linked to the census. And that makes sense because India is a parliamentary democracy and people have to be represented in the legislature. So roughly the assumption, the idea really behind delimitation is that when these constituencies are redrawn, broadly all constituencies should have equal number of people. Not exact numbers, but they should be. So it shouldn't be that some constituencies have huge numbers of people and only one representative, and others have few people but they too have one. So one representative. So the idea is to redraw the constituencies to reflect population change in such a way that all constituencies more or less have same number of people, and each constituency has one member of parliament representing them. And so this obviously can be done only following a census, that's a given. Now, the catch is that we've not had a census after 2011. So the census is yet to take place. But what is complicating matters further is the fact that delimitation and the census being linked is leading to some anxiety given India's federal structures, because certain states have been able to address their population challenge more effectively than some other states. So what that means is that some states have had an exponential increase in their population, while other states have been able to manage their population due to a variety of sociological, cultural, and political reasons. This would mean that there will be more constituencies in those states where the population has gone up. That means they would have more number of representatives in parliament. This is what is creating anxiety at the current juncture. But before we can even figure out how to resolve this, the fact is that the next delimitation exercise itself cannot take place before the 2026 census. And why that is again going back in history. There have been constitutional amendments that have frozen the delimitation exercise. So the earliest we can have a delimitation exercise is after a census takes place in 2026. that's the earliest we can have a delimitation exercise, after 2026, provided a census takes place before that. So these ifs and buts are like, these are unknown factors. We don't know when it will happen. And in the past, so how it happens is that a delimitation commission is notified, and it is chaired by a retired judge of the Supreme Court. And the delimitation commission's recommendations cannot ordinarily be challenged in any court of law. It's, in a way, it's final. The work of the delimitation takes at least 4 years, 3 to 4 years. So that is why you said, for instance, that the earliest it can happen is 2028. But in principle, I understand that in an electoral democracy, population changes should be reflected in representation. However, I don't quite see why we should wait for the next exercise for this bill to be implemented, and then further changes could have happened later on. That is where I think there is some anxiety about the intention behind introducing this bill.
The other criticism, like you mentioned, is over the lack of a provision for representation of women from other backward classes or OBCs. This has been stressed by political observers, but also several leaders of opposition in the parliament, including Rahul Gandhi and Asaduddin Owaisi, who broadly shared that the lack of reservation for OBC women would ultimately only benefit Savarna women. Could you elaborate on this?
That is indeed an extremely contentious issue. See, the government's explanation would be that how do we assign a quota for OBC women in the absence of data? And for that, a census has to take place, and only then can delimitation happen, and only then, and only then, and only then, which is absolutely right. I mean, all of these things have to take place. It's nobody's contention that it should be done in an unscientific and arbitrary way. However, the bill as of now makes no mention about the intention of introducing a OBC quota. It talks about the SC/ST quota because it's constitutionally mandated, and that is the proportion of reservation for the non-reserved seats also in any case. So it replicates that. However, as far as OBCs are concerned, since there has been no such precedent, the bill doesn't talk about it. And that is worrying because, as you said very rightly, there is really there is no one unified category called Indian woman. Women in India are divided along caste, religion, class, and many other language, ethnic identity, you name it. It's very important that these intersectionalities are respected, acknowledged, and represented. And in the absence of that, what tends to happen, and this is true not only in India, but in any electoral landscape, what would happen is that those who have already an advantage within the system, which they have because of historical reasons, access to better education, employment, social connections, political connections, they tend to monopolize, control, and dominate politics and representative bodies. So if we are really committed to the idea of representation, it's very important to understand these intersectionalities and ensure that women from what is described as the OBC communities find their role and space. As we saw in the Panchayati system, having that SC/ST quota within the 33% reservation has made a lot of difference in many instances. It is not to say that everywhere in rural India things have changed, that would be an exaggeration. But it does bring about change. To see women from the OBC communities as MPs speaking up in parliament, this will serve as a role model. It will be inspirational for other women who belong to the same community. It will also help the rest of India hear their voices and understand what their concerns are, because that's what finally representative politics is all about. But this is, again, as I said earlier, this is not the time to lose hope. I think this is the time to actually build on the optimism that the introduction of the bill has resulted in. It is for us, for, as I said, for women's groups, for feminist mobilizational practices to kick in, to talk to people, canvass, create links with OBC groups, and ensure that the Parliament of India finally acknowledges the need for this quota. So it's one thing to say that the bill doesn't have A, B, C, and D. It doesn't have many things. But if we are a democracy, then hopefully we should be able to ensure that these things get introduced. In other words, without democratic mobilization outside the parliament, I don't see these changes happening automatically. And without that, the bill will remain a pale shadow of what it was intended to be.
Now, finally, coming back to the intention that you mentioned, several political analysts across the board have also pointed out the political ambitions of introducing this bill in the run up to the upcoming general elections in 2024. Do you see a significant impact of the bill on the voters in the coming elections? But also, what do you think would be the impact of this on India's broader socio-political landscape?
So I'll answer this question in two parts. So the first part about impact on 24 elections. See, there's no denying that the current ruling party in many states has actually benefited from women stepping out to vote. So it surely is a way of reaching out to those women and saying that, look, we are going to do this, and travel with us and vote for us. Although, if I may digress a little bit, men in India, and again, I know there is no one kind of man in India, but I'm using that term for convenience right now. There has been a lot of discomfort that men in politics have expressed about the idea of women's political participation. So, as early as the Constituent Assembly, there were men in the Assembly who feared that granting women equal political rights will erode civilizational values that represent India. And similar voices were heard even with regard to the current version of the Women's Reservation Bill, not in 2023 so much, but in its previous avatars and previous outings, one did hear politicians talk about it. So, I think the impact will be more on women voters, if at all. I think there will be, there will be some section of politically active women who will see that, who will see the introduction of this bill as some kind of assurance for them, for their professional futures in politics, and that's a good thing, because I think more women will feel motivated. So I can't really predict in electoral, in an electoral sense, what's going to happen. But I do think that given the fact that many women in some states have shown their clear preference for the ruling party, this might help consolidate the party's popularity amongst those women. And I think it will also motivate women to participate in politics. But the long term impact of this bill, whenever it is introduced, there is no denying that this women being able to participate forcefully and equally in decision making will make a difference to the lives of women in India. At least that's the hope. We have to remember that on the one hand is the introduction of this bill, and on the other hand is the unhappy realization of women's extremely low work participation rate in India. And that's due to a complex set of factors. A very important factor being unequal division of household labor, public violence, lack of safety, poor infrastructure and transport that is friendly to women, loss of employment in agriculture where mechanization has come and farming itself has become unattractive and there aren't enough alternative employment opportunities. So there is a range of reasons for why women's work participation rate has really dipped in India. Now, under these circumstances, the hope is that if you have more and more women participating in politics and in decision making in parliament, there might be legislations that will introduce policies and new programs and make or undertake new initiatives that will actually facilitate women's access to better transport, better infrastructure, newer employment opportunities, laws to deal with sexual violence, lack of safety. In a way, the hope really is, and this is, this hope is not based on just wishful thinking. Studies actually have shown, for instance, a study by Esther Duflo and Chattopadhyay actually show that in panchayats where women have actually got 33% reservations, there is an impact on the kind of policies that women have initiated. Women are more likely to initiate policies on drinking water, on health than men are. And this is borne out by facts. So the fond hope really is that when women do, whenever this becomes a reality and there are more women, as I said in the beginning, that they will be able to set the agenda differently. If they are going to perpetuate and reinforce the existing politics, which is driven by competitive kind of an approach to mobilization of communities and castes, if they can move away from that, if they can move away from sectarian and partisan politics and actually bring about these transformative changes, I think that will change India's social landscape very, very effectively.
Well, despite the contentions, issues, and lack of transparency over implementation, the passage of the bill does seem to be an important moment for India, especially given that the bill comes at a time when we see more women voters in the country than ever before, where the numbers have increased with every election over the last 2 decades. Well, only time will tell how this pans out in the coming years, but like you said, this is not the time to lose hope. Thank you so much, Professor Menon, for sharing your insights. You were listening to South Asia Chat. To learn more about our work, visit us at isas.nus.edu.sg. You can also get updates on social media. We're on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram.